At a vast manufacturing plant, a black janitor silently cleaned the floors, her mind burdened by hospital debts and the threat of deportation. Yet beneath her worn gloves resided a brilliant mechanic. So when a crucial machine malfunctioned, causing engineers to panic, she humbly intervened and repaired it. Then, without seeking recognition, she hurried to the hospital to tend to her ailing son. Unbeknownst to her, a powerful figure had been observing, poised to make a decision that would reshape her life beyond her wildest dreams. Before we delve into this narrative, please let us know your viewing location. We value your insights. At 11:11 p.m., Clarice remained awake. By 11:38 p.m. she was still awake, not in her home, a rented room plagued by mold and a stubborn lock, but seated in a vinyl chair beside a hospital bed, her spine hunched from exhaustion, her coat still zipped as she never intended a long stay. But she always stayed. A soft beep echoed. Machines hummed beside her. And on the bed lay her son Jalen, 10 years old, fragile, dark-skinned, his chest rising unevenly beneath the thin hospital blanket. His heart had been defective since birth, and no one could explain why a child with such inner light had to endure such profound chest pain. Clarice reached out and adjusted the nasal tube, her hands trembling not from weariness, but from the fear that had become her constant companion. This was her reality. No husband, no nearby relatives for support, no insurance covering everything, no green card granting her rights if questions arose. Just her and him. Her janitorial wages barely sufficed for medication. And still it was a miracle she even had the job. She'd fabricated documents months prior to secure better coverage for him. A desperate act, one misstep from exposure, one ICE officer away from being torn apart. Her shift hadn't even begun. At 4:30 a.m., Clarice was already en route, walking 2 blocks through the snow to catch the earliest bus across town. Newark's winter was relentless, especially for a woman who barely had time to sleep, let alone warm her fingers. By 5:12 she arrived at the back gate of Magnetic Dynamics Corp., a colossal steel and circuit manufacturing facility. Most employees wouldn't arrive for another hour. He as always was first. There was no applause for the woman who scrubbed oil-stained floors before dawn, no thanks for the spotless toilets in the men's locker room, just the soft creak of her boots and the gentle jingle of keys at her hip. She wore an oversized gray uniform and a knitted cap pulled low over her brow. Her face was etched not solely by age, but by years of holding her breath around immigration officials, of evading inquiries, of muting her brilliance so as not to appear threatening. Yet despite it all, her eyes still held a spark. Because Clarice was once someone. Back home in Trinidad she wasn't a janitor. She was a certified mechanic, known in her village as the engine whisperer. Her hands understood machines better than most men who trained for years. But none of that mattered here. Not after her visa renewal was denied. Not after she was forced to accept any available work to survive. Survival now meant invisibility. It meant polite nods when young engineers passed without acknowledging her. It meant never correcting anyone, never drawing attention, never excelling too much at anything. And yet, as she passed the R12 unit, the largest machine in the plant's west wing, she paused. The hum was off. It was subtle, something no one else would notice, but Clarice noticed. He always did. She adjusted her mop, quickly glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching. Then she crouched near the base, feigning cleaning. Her fingers, concealed by rubber gloves, brushed the steel casing near the intake valve. Faint warmth. Too soon, too hot. Her stomach clenched. She scrawled a note on the back of a cleaning schedule. R12 valve fluctuation. Check before next cycle. But she knew it wouldn't be read. No one read notes from the janitor. As the factory lights flickered on and machines sputtered to life, Clarice moved like a specter among shadows. Mopping, wiping, disappearing. No one noticed the weary curve in her shoulders, or how she clutched her side when she stooped to scrub the floor, or that every 15 minutes she checked the time not for a break, but counting down until she'd ride the bus back to the hospital, where her true world existed. One machine, one woman, the world where her son still smiled at her through tubes, where she read him science books and tucked tiny blankets around his legs, where she prayed every night she'd survive one more week without being fired, arrested, or worse. And yet, even here, in the humming underbelly of a company that barely knew her name, Clarice maintained a certain grace. She mended what she could. She smiled when someone bumped into her in the hallway. She hummed old calypso songs while polishing the chrome edges of the machines. And she never ever let them see the fear in her eyes. Not yet, because a moment was approaching. A moment when the machine would fail and everything would hinge on someone seeing what she saw. And when that moment arrived, Clarice would be ready. One machine, one woman no one believes, and one CEO observing from the shadows. By the time the morning shift flooded the floor, the factory had shed its slumber. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sharp reflections on every cold surface. The scent of lubricant, aged metal, and anticipation filled the air. Amidst the growing din of production, a sudden shift occurred. The low rumble of a machine sputtered and fell silent. It was the R12. The plant's main artery had stalled, and in that instant, the silence felt louder than the siren that never sounded. Initially, no one panicked. Engineers swiftly stepped in, their white collars slightly creased from hurried arrivals, typing frantically into terminals. Valves were rechecked, lines retightened. A cacophony of voices overlapped. Codes, readings, electrical jargon. Yet the error lights continued to blink red, a persistent pulse of impending disaster. The R12 wasn't just another machine. It was vital to a $7 million contract due to ship in less than 2 days. From the mezzanine, Clarice stood motionless, mop in hand. She'd been cleaning the safety railings when the commotion began. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw the panel flicker, the same panel she'd silently monitored for weeks. She had cautioned herself against involvement. It wasn't her place, but something compelled her. A sense of knowing, of duty, of an undeniable truth. She descended cautiously, weaving through startled workers until she neared the engineers. "Excuse me," she said, barely audible over the noise. One of the younger men glanced at her without genuine attention. "This area is off limits," he snapped, turning back to his tablet. She paused, steadied her breath, and spoke again. "The intake valve, it's jammed. If the system resets now, it'll burn the secondary line." Her voice was calm, but inside, everything screamed. They laughed instinctively, thoughtlessly, not out of malice but disbelief. A janitor offering advice on the facility's most intricate machine. It was preposterous. And yet her gaze didn't waver. Her voice didn't tremble. "Just give me 2 minutes," she said quietly. "You're about to lose more than time." One of them looked uncertain, but before anyone could speak, the floor manager appeared. Rudd was a large, older man with a gait that suggested he'd been there longer than anyone else. He surveyed her uniform, unimpressed. "Your custodial staff. You're not certified to touch that unit." Clarice met his eyes. No fear, no defiance, just truth. "I'm not asking to touch it," she said. "I'm asking to try. If I'm wrong, you lose nothing. But if I'm right, we save the plant." A heavy silence hung in the air. With a scoff and a dismissive wave, Rudd relented. "Fine, let the janitor have a go. Maybe we all need the laugh." The engineer stepped back. Clarice approached the R12, her heartbeat thudding like a second engine in her ears. She crouched low beside the auxiliary panel, her fingers moving with assured precision. She located the melted wire cluster hidden near the intake, exactly what she'd feared. She pulled a zip tie from her coat pocket, a trick from long ago, and rerouted the circuit. Her hands worked swiftly but unhurriedly, as if she were restoring something sacred. Then, reaching beneath the base, she toggled the manual reset. The machine shuddered, sputtered once, then roared. Green lights spread across the panel, stabilized. Online. Full pressure. The entire floor seemed to collectively inhale and exhale. Someone patted her. Cheers erupted, soft at first, then louder. One of the engineers applauded. Someone patted her on the back. For a moment she felt acknowledged, but only for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered almost to herself. Then she turned quickly, pulling on her gloves and walking toward the hallway. No one asked why she was in such a hurry. No one knew she had only 15 minutes to catch the next bus to the hospital. But someone was watching. Behind the observation glass stood a man in a dark wool coat, hands folded across his chest. No badge, no clipboard, just stillness and eyes that missed nothing. Thomas Weller, the CEO. He'd arrived quietly that day, curious about rumors of a woman who repaired more than she claimed. He'd anticipated whispers. What he witnessed was a revelation. He watched Clarice vanish around the corner, her gray coat catching the light one last time, and in that moment, something settled heavily in his chest. a mix of guilt, wonder, and realization. He simply turned. Someone extraordinary had been standing in plain sight, and no one had truly seen her until now. Until him. A CEO in disguise, a quiet hospital hallway, and the moment a woman's secret life becomes impossible to overlook. Thomas Weller said nothing as Clarice disappeared down the corridor. He didn't call out, didn't ask anyone who she was. He simply turned, adjusted the scarf at his collar and quietly followed, keeping far enough to remain unnoticed, close enough to stay connected. There was something in her movements, swift but burdened as if each step carried years of untold stories, and something within him long dormant told him he needed to know them. She exited the factory without ceremony, blending into the dull gray morning like a phantom belonging to the cold. No car, no ride waiting, just a city bus stop on a slush-covered corner where she stood with arms folded, breath fogging in short, silent puffs. Thomas watched from a discreet distance in his sedan, the wipers clearing frost as she boarded the bus. He didn't hesitate. He followed. They passed shuttered diners, chain-link fences, broken neon signs flickering above pawn shops. 35 minutes later, she disembarked near Newark General Hospital. Her steps were quicker now, more urgent. Thomas parked down the street, pulled his coat tighter and entered the lobby moments after her. She didn't head for the ER or any front desk. She knew precisely where she was going. Up the elevator, down the hallway to the right, room 327. Through a narrow sliver of window, Thomas saw her stop just outside the door. Clarice adjusted her coat, smoothed her sleeves, then with a breath so deep it made her shoulders tremble, she stepped inside. What he saw next made him freeze. Inside the room, under dim hospital light, a small boy lay curled on a bed, wires taped to his chest, an oxygen tube beneath his nose, skin pale as paper. She sat beside him, pulling a thermos from her bag. Clarice's entire posture softened. The strength she carried at the factory melted into something even more potent. Love. She stirred the spoon gently, blowing over it before holding it to the boy's lips. "Warm, baby, just like you like it," she whispered. Her voice was lower, gentler than Thomas had ever heard, filled with melody, patience, and a kind of grace no boardroom had ever taught him. He stepped back, not wanting to intrude but unable to leave. When she began talking to the boy about the R12, his eyes faintly lit up. "You fixed it?" he asked, his voice weak but filled with pride. "I helped," she said, smiling with a hint of mischief. "But I had to leave fast before the machines got jealous." They both giggled, and for a moment, it was just a mother and son in a world they had carved out of pain and survival, stitched together with faith and stories. Later, after the boy dozed off, Clarice sat by the window, gazing at the dark clouds outside. She pulled a crumpled envelope from her coat and silently examined it. Thomas couldn't see the contents, but he recognized that type of envelope: legal paper, government ink, and the way she stared at it as if it were both a threat and a farewell told him enough. Her visa, her fabricated insurance, her job. He left the hallway, made a call, and within 2 hours had 2 names on retainer: a top immigration attorney and a healthcare fraud defense specialist. He didn't ask her permission. He didn't need to, because now he knew she wasn't just the woman who saved his machine. She was the woman holding together an entire world. Alone, quietly, brilliantly, and if no one else was going to fight for her, he would. That night he returned to the office and pulled up her employment file. It was thin, sparse, a paper barrier built by blind adherence to protocol. But buried in a past application folder was a detail. Clarice had once applied for a junior technician role, denied of course, due to incorrect documentation, no formal referrals. One note in the margin: highly knowledgeable, likely overstating experience. The next morning Thomas closed the file, jaw tight. Overstating, he thought. They had no idea. The following morning Clarice found an envelope in her locker. Inside, a personal letter from the CEO signed in blue ink. A request, no, an invitation to join the company's certified technical apprenticeship program, with full pay and protected status while legal matters were addressed. At first she froze, then read it again, then again. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself, and when no one was looking she wiped her cheek with the back of her gloved hand. That evening she returned to room 327. Her son stirred awake, his eyes still heavy. "Mama," he mumbled. Clarice bent low, her voice trembling now. "Guess what, baby? Mama's going back to school." He smiled in his sleep and she kissed his forehead. Not every miracle needs thunder. Some arrive quietly like folded letters in cold lockers, or strangers who finally look up and truly see you. The rising star, a resentful man, and the ensuing storm. When light dares to shine too brightly, the letter changed everything. Within months, Clarice transitioned from invisible to indispensable. The apprenticeship program embraced her like a long-held secret finally revealed. Her test scores shattered benchmarks. Her hands moved with grace and certainty, earning silent nods from even the most skeptical engineers. She never flaunted her abilities. She simply delivered, and one by one, those who once passed her by in hallways now paused to ask questions, then leaned in to hear her answers. By the end of the year, Clarice had risen to lead a pilot team tasked with redesigning outdated machinery for higher efficiency. It was her concept to recalibrate the coil flow, her blueprint that reduced the R-series energy cost by 12%. Her name began appearing in email threads, then in internal newsletters, and finally on a project plaque. But while recognition blossomed around her, not everyone celebrated. Some viewed her ascent not as inspiration but as a threat. Rudd, the floor manager who once dismissed her with a smirk, watched in silence as she entered rooms he once commanded. His name no longer topped every meeting agenda. Clarice wasn't rude to him. She was polite, professional, and that somehow made it worse. She didn't seek vengeance, didn't gloat. She simply outgrew the space he believed she belonged in, and he, bitter, overlooked, and increasingly insecure, began to scheme. It started subtly. A misplaced folder, a meeting she missed because her invitation was accidentally omitted from the list. But it didn't deter her, so he dug deeper. He accessed her digital files after hours. Then one Friday evening he submitted a report to corporate security, accusing Clarice of leaking internal schematics to a rival firm. Attached was an email chain with blueprints and her name in the metadata. It looked damning. It was designed to. The news hit the factory like a shockwave. Clarice was summoned, stunned, to an internal investigation room. Her hands were steady, but her voice broke slightly as she said, "That file isn't mine. I didn't send anything." She recognized the drawing. It was hers. But the message chain was fabricated. Her project team froze. Some whispered doubts, others looked away. She was suspended pending review. And once again Clarice walked out of the factory. But this time not by choice. That night she didn't go to the hospital. First she went home, sat at her tiny table with a cup of cold tea, and every notebook she had filled over the last year. Page by page she retraced every line of code, every adjustment, every timestamp. Then she remembered. The third-floor lab had a security camera, and on the day of the alleged email leak she'd worked from the R&D annex alone. Except Rudd had entered briefly, said nothing, just looked around, then left. She filed a request for access, citing the investigation. 2 days later she sat with the footage in front of the review board. There he was, copying her notes from a workstation while glancing over his shoulder. It was quiet, chilling. "This isn't about ambition," she said, looking at them. "It's about truth. And who gets believed?" The board exonerated her. Rudd was terminated. Some apologized. Most remained silent. Clarice returned to her team without ceremony, picked up her tools and resumed her work. But something had shifted, not just in her peers but in the way she stood. Taller, not louder but stronger. She had fought to be seen, and now even the shadows knew her name. And yet, as headlines about her vindication circulated internally, Clarice requested none of the spotlight. Instead she sent a quiet memo to Thomas Weller requesting a meeting, not to report, not to accuse, but to propose an idea. "There are other women like me," she wrote, "who never even get to the door. Let's build a new door. A proposal, a legacy, and a woman who chooses to rise not just for herself, but for those still waiting in the dark." Thomas Weller read Clarice's memo 3 times. It wasn't long, barely a page, but it carried more weight than any quarterly report he'd reviewed all year. She wasn't asking for a raise, not even a promotion. She wanted a program, a gateway, a way to bring in more women like her. Immigrants, single mothers, overlooked talents with nowhere to go but down unless someone uplifted them. And what struck him most was the way she signed it. With gratitude and with hope for those who come next. The meeting was brief. In his office overlooking the skyline, Clarice stood in the same gray coat she always wore. She didn't sit until he insisted. Her tone was respectful but resolute. She laid out the outline: a technical training scholarship for women from underserved communities, a support fund for children needing critical care, and a mentorship circle run by current employees. "We have the space," she said. "We just need to fill it with light." Thomas said yes. Immediately. Without hesitation. 3 months later, the factory floor looked transformed. Not in paint or machines but in energy. There were new faces: young women, older women, women in headscarves with diverse skin tones and accents and backstories. Some nervous, some curious, all determined. They entered with uncertainty and left each day standing taller. Clarice became their guide. Not their boss, not their savior, but their proof that someone like them could belong here, could thrive. She was offered an executive role with a corner office and company car. She declined the title, accepted the office, and quietly requested that half the space be converted into a resource room for trainees. When asked by reporters why she refused public recognition, she smiled and said, "Because the real work doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to be done." But inside her drawer she kept the very first blueprint she ever drew at the plant, creased, stained, and precious. Clarice didn't seek retribution against Rudd. When asked if she'd press charges, she shook her head. "We don't grow by dragging others down. We grow by lifting others up," she said. Instead, she proposed adding a unit on workplace ethics to the apprenticeship curriculum. That was her justice. Not punishment but prevention. Not erasing the past but shaping the future. And in doing so she became more than a story. She became a standard. The following spring, a new building opened across from the factory, the Clarice Project Center for Technical Empowerment and Pediatric Care. Inside, children received treatment while their mothers studied in classrooms next door. Clarice stood quietly at the ribbon cutting, her son Jalen, stronger now, smiling at her side. When the crowd applauded, she took a step back, letting others stand in the front row. She looked toward the balcony where a group of young women in navy uniforms stood beaming. One of them waved. Clarice waved back. That night, as the sun melted behind the smokestacks and the street lamps flickered to life, Clarice stood by the window of her small office and watched the students pour out of the center. They walked in groups, laughing, holding notebooks, some stopping to adjust their toolkits. In their stride was the confidence she once had to cultivate in silence. In their eyes was the fire she once had to conceal. Now it burned freely. She turned to Jalen, now 13 and inquisitive. "Mama," he asked, "was it worth it?" She smiled, brushing her fingers across his cheek. "Every scraped knee, every silent night, every step I thought no one saw. It was worth it for this." And as they locked up the lights and walked toward the parking lot, mother and son together, the legacy she built followed them. Not in stone or salary but in people, in possibility, in life. But maybe not really the end, because somewhere in another quiet room, another woman is dreaming with calloused hands and a bright mind, just waiting for someone to believe in her too. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.